Hello and welcome to SkySwitch University. In this unit we want to cover adding domains. Now in your Dash Manager you're going to click on Manage PBX. Now this level of your account is what we refer to as the reseller account level. Now when we click down into domains, that's going to take us into particular domains. Now let's talk about domains for a moment. Domains represent a customer, but they do not necessarily represent one service address. And what I mean by that is this. When you set up your customers, let's say you have a customer that has multiple service addresses. You need to decide if there's going to be extension to extension dialing between those service addresses, then you would still put those service addresses or those locations in the same domain. Now if it doesn't matter and you don't need extension to extension dialing, then you can put those service addresses or those locations in different domains. Okay, and so you'll have to decide find out from your customer how they want to operate, and that will help determine whether a particular domain is going to have multiple service addresses, multiple locations, or it's going to be one service address per domain. Okay, so here on the domains page, you're going to see that your suffix on your domain names are going to have your reseller ID.service. Now every domain that you add is going to have that suffix. Now you're going to decide here what the prefix is. So when we need to add a domain, we're going to click on Add Domain, and then we're going to give the domain a name. Okay, so but I want you to click on Help here to the right, and let's type in domain, and you're going to see an article here, Best Practices for Managing a Domain Name. Now I want you to understand there's some key things here that you need to take into consideration when adding the prefix name to your domain name. Choose one word only. Okay, that's very important. It's important that you understand you can use upper or lowercase letters, and you can use alphanumeric naming. So these would be examples that would work fine. But here's a real critical note. Do not include spaces, underscore, period, comma, or any other special characters in your prefix. Do not use any special characters in your prefix. And so you want to go through here and check this document and understand it before naming your domain names or your prefixes. But that's the key. All right, so we'll go with ABC Company as our prefix. Now in the description field you can then name it the normal company name. It's the normal company description name, and it could be incorporated. Okay, so that's naming your domain, giving it the prefix. Now you don't have to give it the suffix. The system's going to add that for you, and we'll see that in a moment. Let's close our doc here. And just understand that you can always get help on, any time along the way by just clicking on this help button to the right. You can get to our knowledge base. Okay, so back to adding the domain. We've added a prefix. We've added a description. Now, the email sender. This is the email from which email notifications, etc., are going to come from in regard to this customer. So I'm going to put support@skyswitch.com. Most of our resellers will put a support email address, or they will put they'll even create a no reply email address and use that here. You could do that as well. This is going to be the email, so like your users or customers that are on this domain or in this domain, when they receive a notification like voicemail to email or a voicemail was left, or any kind of notification from the system, this is the email address it's going to come from. Okay, so that's important to set. And then also you can see here you can set a domain a domain up as residential or business. Of course, 99.9% of the time it's business, so this will be left as no. But you can set up a domain as a residential domain. Now, what is the difference between a residential domain and a business domain? The residential domain doesn't have all the business IVR messages in the domain that you typically have, as in regard to voicemail and other things that are happening on the system. I had a reseller up in Canada that opened up a resort, and they had phones in the cabins, and so they wanted to use a residential domain because it was, in a residential setting. That's very rare, but you can certainly do that if you need to. Now, the status, we can set it to active or locked. If we set it to locked, it's going to lock down all the calling, inbound and outbound, on this domain. It's rare that you would need to use this, and you need to be careful with it because it would also lock down any 911 calling, from this domain. It would lock down all inbound and outbound calling. So, of course, normally 99% of the time you're going to have it as active, and so that is the basic settings. Or those are the basic settings, on the domain. Now, when you click next, it's going to take us to the defaults page. Okay, so on the defaults page, what's happening is we are setting defaults that when we create users, they're going to take on these default settings. So these are domain level default settings, but when they really come into effect when you create a user, and that user is going to take these default settings onto the user when you create the user. Now, when you create the user, you can also then change any of these defaults at the user level. So I just want you to understand they're just defaults. Okay, so the first default we come to is the dial permission. Okay, on this domain, we're going to set the default dial permission. So when we create our users, it's going to take on this default dial permission. Now, the default dial permission is set to permit all. I actually wish it were set to US and Canada. Permit all allows for international calling. Now, let me talk a moment about international calling. When we create your reseller account, we're going to create it with international calling turned off. Okay, that's just across the board, and it's across your whole domain. Your whole reseller account. So any domains you create initially, international calling is turned off. Now, when you have a customer that needs international calling, you're going to request through a support ticket that we turn on international calling on your reseller account. When we turn it on your reseller account, I want you to understand that it's turned on for all your domains, current domains, and any future domains that you create or add. So that's how international calling works initially. Now, the key to international calling is that it really matters at the user level. And so we're setting the default for this domain, and I want you to make it a practice to set your dial permission default to US and Canada. Set it to US and Canada, then later, if you need to allow a particular user to dial international, you can go in on that user, on the profile page of that user, and you can set their dial permission from US and Canada to permit all. So this is very important, and I want you to use this as the best practice. On every domain you create, set the dial permission to US and Canada, and then when you add your users, they're going to be added as this default dial permission, US and Canada. And then later, if you have a customer that needs international calling, and typically on customers, not everyone in the company is going to need international calling, right? You're going to set it on a per user basis. And so you would go into that user on the profile page and you would set their permission to permit all, which would then allow for the international calling. Okay, so that's what we want to do on dial permission. On time zone, we're just setting the time zone of the the main location or headquarters or main location of the domain. Understand that you could have service addresses in multiple time zones, but we're just setting it for what is primary. And again, this is default and it can be changed at the user level. If you have users that are in the domain but they're in Pacific or Mountain or Central Time, you'll be able to set those time zones on those particular users. Okay, voicemail transcription. Disabled or enabled. We're just setting the default across the domain so that when we add users, it will give you the capability of turning on voicemail transcription or not. Again, it's still going to matter at the user level. You're going to need to enable it at the user level, but this is a default setting across the domain. Okay, so you can decide beforehand, and you can always come back and edit this to enable voicemail transcription across the domain. You're going to set the area code of the particular main location, and you're going to set the caller name. Now this is a 15 character limit. That is and this caller name here is the internal SkySwitch caller name. Later you're going to be able to, during porting or after porting, you're going to be able to set caller name storage. What that is that if this company or this customer of yours wants to display their outbound their caller name outbound to the world, then you have to set up caller name storage. Okay, that's different than right here. This is simply for internal to SkySwitch, between SkySwitch locations. If you have different locations for this company in the domain and they call each other, then this is the caller name that would be displayed. Now, but out to the world, you're going to need caller name storage, and that's covered in a subsequent video as to how you would get that ordered and then put on a particular number. Okay, so also you're going to set your caller ID. All right, we'll set a caller ID. Typically, this is the company's main number or a toll-free number, and then also we're going to set our emergency 911 caller ID here. Now again, this is defaults. We are dealing with defaults. So when we add a user, they're going to take on these default settings. Then you have enable voicemail. You can enable or disable voicemail across the domain. Okay, so these are the default settings. Again, when we add users later, they're going to take on these default settings, but we can change them at the user level. It's really ultimately, that's really where it matters, is what your users are set to, like the dial permission or the time zone, etc. So again, these are defaults, and this is how we set them. Now we're going to click next. It's going to take us to the limitation screen. Now let me talk about limitations. We have different limitations here. We'll talk about these in a moment. Now, primarily limitations matter if you give one of your customers' users Office Manager scope. Okay, so you can have a basic user or an Office Manager user when you give scope or portal access scope to your users. So what happens here is if you give Office Manager access and you set these limitations, to some certain amount, For example, let's just use maximum users. If we set the maximum users to 10, now basic users would not be able to change, they would not be able to add users. But an office manager would be able to add users. So if we set this to max 10 on this domain and we gave Office Manager access, this means that the Office Manager would only be able to add up to 10 users. They would not be able to add the 11th. They would have to call you and ask you to either change this to 11 so they could add the 11th user, or you'd have to set it back to unlimited. Okay, so that's primarily what you see here for users, departments, conference bridges, auto attendance, and call queues. Now the settings for active call limit and external call limit do affect the domain name calling. Now I want you to be careful with setting active call limit. It's inbound and outbound, and if you transfer a call or you forward a call, that would be included in active call limit. So you have to be careful with setting any kind of active call limit. For the most part, this is rarely, if ever, used by our resellers, this active call limit. Now the external call limit is simply or strictly outbound. You'll set outbound call paths. So this would limit them to 5 outbound call paths on this domain. Now again, you want to be careful with setting the external call limit because this would work across all service addresses, that were in the domain. If you had multiple service addresses, multiple locations, and this would be set, across the whole domain. So again, you have to be careful setting these call limits, but you certainly could do that. Pretty much the setting here is just leave these at unlimited, and be careful if and when you give Office Manager access. You'll see later in a subsequent video that Office Manager access is a powerful scope, and it does give that user a lot of ability to make changes in the system. So we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so for now we've set our basic, our defaults, and our limitations, and we're going to click Add. So now we see our domain in the domain list here to the left. And again, you remember we set the prefix and then the suffix is added on for us, 20337.service. So here we can manage our domain, we can edit our domain, or we can again add a domain. It's going to tell us our active calls, external calls, and the users that have been set up in this domain here on the domain screen, and we can filter or search for particular domains here. If we click on manage, it just gives us a quick pop-up here for the ability to jump to a particular part of the domain, and we'll talk about managing domains in a subsequent video. But if we clicked on edit, it would bring us back to those same screens that we just had on adding a domain, basic, defaults, limitations. So if we ever need to change the default settings or change any limitations, we can edit the domain and come back to these screens. Okay, so that's how you add a domain to the system. Make sure you do read this article about best practices for managing a domain. And again, I will point out, do not use any special characters in creating your domain. You'll just cause problems for yourself, headaches later down the road. Okay, so read this article, make sure you understand the best practices for managing a domain name, and this is how you add a domain. So thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, you can send those to onboarding@skyswitch.com.